Welcome to Evil Done Badly, the worst true crime podcast in existence. We've got a 2-pack of cases for you this week, and they're both called the same thing. One is known as the Lonely Hearts Killer, and one is known as the Lonely Hearts Killers, plural. So let's dive in and see which Lonely Hearts Killer or killers were the most dastardly. But first, before we dig into the cases, grab yourself a beverage, hold on to your arse, and let's hear the theme song. This episode of Evil Done Badly is brought to you by Jimmy's Hat Factory. Jimmy's hats come in all shapes and sizes for a snugger, more comfortable fit for your misshapen head. Glides on smooth and are available for men's and women's pleasure. And if you have all the Jimmy hats you need and are looking for somewhere interesting to spend your time, head on over to the Wide World of Paranormal Investigations group on Facebook. Your home for UFOs, UAPs, the NSA, the FBI, and all sorts of other neat acronyms. You'll fit right in there with Gerard and the other 11,000 or so members he's got over there. Now, let's get back to the show. Harvey Glatman was fuck ugly and born in 1927. He wasted no time in exhibiting sadistic sexual desires. He would hang himself in his attic and orgasm as he was passing out. His parents were a little concerned and were told it was just a phase that he would eventually grow out of. As a teenager, he would tie girls up and molest them before taking pictures of them. He got caught in the act when he was 18 years old and charged with robbery. While he was out on bail for this robbery, he kidnapped and molested another girl. This victim went to the police, like you would, and told them that some ugly bastard had felt her up without her permission, and he got himself jailed for 8 months. He gets out of jail and moves to Albany and gets arrested again. This time for a bunch of muggings. He was 20 years old at the time and sentenced to spend 10 years in Sing Sing prison. He was scrutinized by psychiatrists at the time and was declared extremely unattractive and psychopathic. He was released after only 9 years due to his good behavior. Well, they took a whole year off. And also because the employees didn't want to look at his ugly face anymore. In 1957, Glatman would go on to earn the title of Lonely Hearts Killer by hooking up with aspiring models through the personal ads in newspapers. He would contact them under the guise of being a photographer for pulp magazines, and he needed photographs of women tied up to be on the covers of detective stories. He convinced model Judy Dull to show up at his house on August 1st with the promise to pay her $50 to take some provocative bondage photos. These days, you'd tell the ugly bastard to fuck right off, but back then, people were a little more trusting, and $50 went a little farther back then. In any event, don't trust a guy. Ever. Just no, period, don't. So she shows up, and Glatman ties her up, and once she's incapacitated, he has his way with her multiple times and took lots of pictures. He then slapped her in the back of his car, drove 125 miles into the desert, took more pictures of her, and then strangled her before taking even more pictures and burying her. Now, that's terrible. And in March of 1958, Glatman actually becomes a part of something called the Patty Sullivan Lonely Hearts Club in LA. Apparently it was quite the happening place to be back then. And there he met Shirley Bridgeford, a single mother of two who was looking for pretty much anybody who wasn't her ex-husband. She was willing to look past how hideous this guy was and go out on a first date with him. He was calling himself George Williams at the time, and he promised to take her square dancing and to dinner. Now, this guy's not exactly Prince Charming. And who the fuck asks someone to go square dancing? Nobody ever gets laid with the promise of square dancing. Either way, she goes out with him. Now, Glatman pretends to have a headache. And he decides that it's not in his best interest to go dancing, so they just go to dinner instead. And then they head off to a secluded dirt road where Glatman pulled his Dodge Cornet off the road and rolled to a stop. Shirley became uneasy, and her worst fears came to life when Glatman pulled his gun on her and ordered her to undress. She protested, but he was relentless and took numerous pictures of her in various states of nudeness. He went on to violently sexually assault her multiple times and stopped when the sun came up. He stopped when the sun came up to take more pictures. He then turned her over onto her stomach and strangled her from behind with the same piece of rope he strangled Judy Dull with. He then took more pictures of her corpse before leaving her body to decompose in the desert. And 4 months later, Ruth Mercado would also fall victim to the same facade and wind up losing her life and being discarded not far away from where Shirley Bridgeford's body lay. In October of 1958, Glatman was going by the name of Frank Johnson, and he waltzed into the Diane studio on Sunset Boulevard, looking to rent out, well, Diane herself. Diane thought he was a dirtbag from the moment she met him, and she also thought that he smelled funny. So instead of going out with Mr. Johnson herself, she decided to hook him up with one of the new girls, named Lorraine Vigil. Diane set up a meeting for later that night between the two. Glatman was a bit annoyed that Diane wasn't available, but he agreed to meet up with Lorraine and left the studio. In the meantime, Diane could not shake the creepy vibes she was getting off this smelly Johnson fellow and called Lorraine to warn her to be careful of this ugly loser. Lorraine was a little put off and a little uneasy about it, but she didn't want to make a bad impression on her first job, so she went ahead with it anyway. Now, Glatman picks her up that night and tells her there's a change of plans, and they will be going to his personal studio in Anaheim. She starts to think that this creepy guy is up to something and begins questioning his motives and demanding to know what the fuck is actually going on. He would remain evasive and avoid saying anything meaningful. And he speeds up the car and gets agitated with Lorraine's barrage of intense questions. He swerves off the road and comes to a stop on the side of the road. He tells her she's getting on his nerves and to pour out her arms so that he can tie her up. Well, naturally, she didn't agree to do that, and he threatened her with a gun. She continued to struggle, and the gun went off and grazed her thigh. She used the distraction to kick her way out through the door, with Glatman trying to yank her back in by her sweater. She flopped out onto the ground, just as a police cruiser pulled up to check out what the commotion was about. Lorraine ran sobbing to the safety of the police officers to get away from this lunatic. And Glatman just sat there whimpering and muttering to himself before being dragged off to the station. Now, over the past little while, the police knew that girls were going missing, and they had some idea what the ugly bastard looked like. They knew that Glatman was quite possibly the creepy cunt they were looking for, and they grilled him mercilessly. They found his rope and knife in the car, and knew that he had a previous record for various sex crimes. They knew the kidnapper had used being a photographer as a pretext for the abductions, and they found his fancy camera in the car as well. Things were looking bad for him, and they just tormented him for hours until he finally broke and confessed to the 3 previous murders. He also admitted that he had a toolbox full of pictures, full of very incriminating stuff back at his house. He would then take police to what remained of the bodies, and there was no room for doubt about the acts he had committed. His lawyer tried to present him as insane, and that was his only defense, but it didn't work. He got sentenced to be strung up by his nutsack until the end of time. Or at least he should have been. He did, however, get slapped with a death sentence, which is almost as good. He didn't bother to appeal, and was executed by gas chamber only about a year later. Jesus, that's fast. That's no fucking around. There's no lingering around for this guy on death row for 20 years. That's the way it should be. Nice and swift. Gas the fucker. Now, he's also suspected in one other murder from 1954 in Boulder, Colorado. A couple of hikers came across a corpse, and she was then known only as Boulder Jane Doe. The girl was identified 55 years later as Dorothy Howard and hasn't been conclusively linked to Glatman, but it seems kind of likely that he was responsible for it. So, this Harvey Glatman guy is a cunt, and he killed at least 3 people. Now, let's see how he stacks up against the Lonely Hearts Killers. Plural. Raymond Fernandez was born in 1914 in Hawaii, and he went to work on a Spanish farm and got married as a teenager. He was very responsible. He showed just how responsible he was by knocking his wife up 4 times and then running off to be a deadbeat in the Spanish army. And he eventually is a very responsible guy in the army, and he just runs off to the United States in search of a job. So he's abandoned the army, and he's abandoned his family. And in the process of this, he gets bopped on the head by a hefty steel hatch on the boat on the way over, and this broke his skull and the squat part of his brain. Jesus Christ, that's quite the fucking smack. Now, if he hadn't already abandoned his family, he probably would have forgot who they were by now anyways. So he comes out of hospital, gets arrested, and spends a year behind bars, learning voodoo in the process. He would answer personal ads, or Lonely Hearts ads, and use his voodoo magic to charm the women out of their pants and out of their money. Now, he took one of these women back to Spain, and she disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Now, he might have had something to do with it, but it's not proven. He's just a piece of shit, and I don't feel like giving him the benefit of the doubt. Especially knowing the fact that he forged her will in advance and made out like a bandit afterwards. It's a little fishy, to say the least. In 1947, Raymond answered a personal ad from Martha Beck, who just happens to be the other cunt in this story. She was born in Florida in 1920 and was chronically overweight. She claims to have been sexually assaulted by her brother, and also claims that when she told her mom about this sexual assault, her mom responded by beating the crap out of her. She went to nursing school, but was too overweight to get hired at her local hospital. I'm not sure if they worded it that way when they denied her application, but that seems to be the logic here. I don't see you getting away with that these days. That's a great way to get yourself fired and or sued. Now, the Army Hospital in California didn't find her overweight, so they accepted her. They wanted her to work for them, and she moved across the country to work there and got herself knocked up. The dad refused to marry her, and she hauled her pregnant ass back to Florida. She made up a horseshit story about the baby's dad being killed in the war and gained a fair amount of sympathy and wound up in the local paper because of it. Now, she gets knocked up again and convinced this dad to marry her. And then he ran away 6 months later. So she was single, overweight, jobless, with 2 small kids, and spent all her time watching romantic movies and reading Harley Quinn novels. It's fair to say, she hasn't got a lot going for her at the moment. She sounds like quite the catch. Now, before you call me insensitive to her lonely plight, take a second to remember that she's one of the cunts in this story. We're getting to that, so don't feel too sorry for her yet. She puts out a Lonely Hearts ad in the local paper in hopes of attracting someone as desperate as she is. And along comes Raymond. So Fernandez and Beck hook up, and Beck is completely smitten with him. So much so that she gives up on her children and donates them to the Salvation Army so she can shower Raymond with her total devotion. He tells her that he's a criminal, and she's fine with it, because she's devoted to this guy. So they move in together, and Fernandez shows his devotion back to Beck by continuing to use Lonely Hearts ads to attract women so that he can rip them off and occasionally have sex with them. Beck and Fernandez would pose as brother and sister in order to make the prospective victims feel more secure. Now, it's a little backwards. She is so devoted to him that she helps him attract women by pretending to be his sister. Okay? And then, when it seems like Raymond and the woman are getting a little too intimate, she would fly off the handle in a jealous rage and unleash a violent fury upon both of them. So Fernandez, still living with Beck on Long Island, somehow attracts and gets engaged to 66-year-old Janet Fay, and she moves in with them. I have no idea how that works. How he gets engaged to someone else while living with this crazy bitch is beyond me. He must have convinced Beck that there was a bunch of money involved somewhere. Inevitably, Fernandez and Janet wind up in bed together. I mean, they are engaged after all. And Bertha loses it completely and smashes Janet in the head with a hammer. At this point, you'd think Fernandez would throw this nutjob under the bus and get her hauled off to jail. But no. Fernandez responds to this by strangling poor Janet to death. Janet's family would come looking for her, and Fernandez and Beck had run away, and they've already set up shop over in Michigan. Now, somehow, they work their way into another woman's house. The unfortunate victims this time were Delphine Downing and her 2-year-old daughter. Somewhere along the way, Delphine gets annoyed at these 2 fuckers who just moved into her house and becomes agitated with having these fucktards around. Now, Fernandez doesn't approve of her being agitated at them and drugs her with sleeping pills to calm her the fuck down. And it works. Unfortunately, Delphine's 2-year-old did not remain calm and started to get on Beck's nerves as well. Now, Beck proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that her original children were way better off with whoever the Salvation Army paired them up with than with her, because she would go on and she would strangle Delphine's child. This poor kid lived through this, but suffered noticeable bruising to their neck. Now, Fernandez is concerned that when Delphine wakes up from being drugged, she might notice the marks on her child's neck and become concerned. So Fernandez gets proactive and wants to avoid all this uncomfortableness. And he just shoots Delphine before she wakes up. And what a cunt he is. So they stick around Delphine's house for a few days, and the poor child spends a good portion of her time crying. I can't say I blame her. These two just shot her mom, and they're fucking idiots. So Beck, Martha, can't deal with it anymore and just drowns the child in the basin. I told you she was a cunt. She's a proper one. And then these two bastards buried the two bodies in the basement and decided to evade capture by continuing to live in the dead woman's house. So, friends and neighbors were concerned about the disappearance of the Downings and sent the cops to check on them. Now, Beck and Fernandez were still there, and Fernandez just pretty much confessed right away. He would not only confess to these 3 murders, but to 14 others all around the USA. He would later try to retract his confession, saying it was only to protect the woman he loved. But that was horseshit. No one loved Martha. They were tried together, and the pair created a media frenzy. Most of the media were completely unkind about Beck's weight and appearance, when they should have been more concerned with the fact that these two evil cunts should be strung up by their nutsacks for eternity. Beck tried to make the case for being abused and incestuously knocked up at 13 as justification for her actions. She also said she attempted suicide 6 times in the last year. Whatever. Martha, you're a child drowning cunt. Who are you? Get the fuck over it. The trial would drag on for 44 days, with the courtrooms exploding with onlookers who were fascinated by these two fucks. The jury of 10 men and 2 women would find them guilty of first-degree murder and get them moved from Michigan, where there was no death penalty at the time, to New York, where, yay, the death penalty is an option. Now, they spent 2 years on death row before being put in the electric chair, and their whirlwind romance of murderous philandering came to an abrupt end on March 8th, 1951. So there you have 2 tales of murder that make it very hard to trust anyone. Everyone who's looking for love in the paper or on the internet is obviously a psycho. Don't get sucked in by these bastards. Go find somewhere else to be horny. Like the library. Never mind. There's definitely psychos at the library. So, who was the most heinous Lonely Hearts killer or killers? Harvey Glatman or Martha Beck and Raymond Fernandez? Well, Glatman got caught, and while he was just getting started, and he probably would have killed a bunch more. He killed 3 people, and he may have run up quite the total if he was left unchecked. And these 2 other fucking bozos were responsible for at least 3 murders, one of a very young child, and it's quite possible Fernandez was responsible for up to 14 more besides that. So I think it's safe to say that this pair was a whole lot more scary than Harvey. Martha was, after all, a crazy jealous bitch who drowned babies. Raymond himself probably wouldn't even sink to that level. And he confessed to killing around 15 or more people. Either way, they're all psychos who got what they deserve. Fuck these people. And there you have it. Another terrible episode of the worst true crime podcast ever, Evil Done Badly, is in the books. If you would like to reach out and suggest future episode topics, we can be reached on Twitter or Instagram at Evil Done Badly, or by email at evildonebadly@gmail.com. And if you would like to support the show, you can check out the Evil Done Badly True Crime Compendium Volume 1 book over on Amazon. It's like the podcast, but without you having to listen to my babbling in person. It's available for free on Kindle Unlimited, or available to purchase as an ebook or paperback. It's just as terrible as this podcast. Now, some of the sentences actually make sense, and you might enjoy it, so thanks for checking it out. And thank you for listening. My name is Dick, and I will see you next time on this terrible podcast. Bye-bye.